Empirical studies on gender differences in language use began nearly 6 decades ago. Gradually, they shifted from the focus on the simple dichotomy between man talk and woman talk to the focus on the complexities of gender construction and display through language. Many researchers have also broadened their scope of inquiry into construction and display of sexualities in addition to genders. The earliest studies, such as Wolfram's 1969 work among African American speakers in Detroit, Trudgell's 1972 study of sociolects in Norwich, England, and Lebaum's 1972 research of speech in the inner city noted that regardless of social class and ethnic background, women used more standard features in their speech than men. In a series of studies, sociologists Candace West and Don Zimmerman found a tendency for men to interrupt others, both men and women, more than women did. Penelope Eckert, whose work on jocks and burnouts we discussed earlier with regard to speech variations based on social class, also found that within each social class group, there were also an observable variation in gender. Jock girls, for example, used more standard English forms than jock boys did. In the burnout group, on the other hand, girls used fewer standard forms than boys. In other words, if we place the four groups on the continuum, burnout girls would use the least standard speech, followed by burnout boys, followed by jock boys, and followed by jock girls as the most standard speakers. The overall tendency for women to use more prestigious standard forms than men is not limited to English. Farida Abu Haidar, for instance, found that while women did not have access to standard Arabic in public settings, they did not speak prestigious dialects. However, as soon as they gained such access, they began to adopt more standard Arabic forms in speech than men did. Carmen Fott, investigating the sound patterns of Chicano English, found that girls tended to front oo sounds, in other words, pronounce words like fruit as fruit, more than boys, although the pattern varied both by social class and the level of affiliation with local gangs. Multiple researchers have provided a variety of explanations for women's tendency towards more standard language. Elizabeth Gordon, based on her survey conducted in New Zealand, concluded that women use standard forms not as a matter of self-promotion, but as a matter of avoidance. Non-standard forms were associated with lower socioeconomic classes, and women of the lower socioeconomic classes were stereotypically perceived as sexually immoral. The use of standard forms allowed women to avoid being stereotyped as promiscuous. Penelope Brown, in her study of a Mayan community, postulated that one of the reasons women used more standard and polite forms is to avoid physical abuse from men and to build solidarity with other women. In her 1976 dissertation, Patricia Nichols studied the speech of black women in the rural South, especially those who spoke Gullah, an Anglo-African Creole used along the coast of Georgia, South Carolina, and the Barrier Islands. Nichols found that women adopted more standard forms of English than men because of the job market. Women tended to work as domestic help in white families, where they both had exposure to standard forms and had to adopt them to gain and keep employment. Men, on the other hand, worked in local environments and did not need to use the standard forms. These studies, among others, provide support to the idea proposed by Peter Trudgell in 1972 that upward mobility was available to women mainly through the symbolic capital, such as language, adherence to social norms, and behavioral virtue. While the economic situation has changed drastically in the past 40 years, and women are not generally reliant on their parents or spouses for their economic stability and social status, the social norms of language use may change more slowly than the economic factors. In the 1990s, scholars also began to explore the masculine language use. This change in approach is associated with a rejection of the notion that men's language is the norm, the baseline, so to say, and it is women's speech that is in some ways deviant. A new idea took root that men and women both use language to construct their respective masculinity and femininity. While women may use standard forms to construct identities as properly behaved, virtuous, upstanding members of society, men may use non standard forms to construct themselves as tough, street smart, and physically strong, the qualities stereotypically associated with non standard speaking lower socioeconomic classes. Scott Kiesling has worked extensively on the construction of masculinity through language. In his 1996 work, he convincingly demonstrated that men use non-standard forms, including G-dropping in ing and in words, to claim power gained through physical strength rather than social hierarchy. Up until the 1990s, the investigations into language and gender were somewhat essentialist, although researchers did look for some explanations for the variation among the social factors. But in the past 2 decades, scholars began to problematize the clear-cut, intrinsically defined concept of gender and gender differentiation. In the late 1990s, Penelope Eckert and Sally McConnell-Ginnett put forward the proposal that gender is socially constructed and discursively constructed through language and interaction and within communities of practice. Thus, what it means to be a proper person of a particular gender varies from one community to another, and therefore linguistic displays of gender vary from one community to another. Such displays are intertwined with linguistic displays of social class, ethnicity, professional or cultural affiliation, and other social categories. Carmen Fott, for example, demonstrated that variation in the U fronting in Chicano English depended on the intricate interplay of such facets of the speaker's identity as gender, social class, ethnicity, and the degree of affiliation with local gangs. Penelope Eckert's work showed that women generally had a greater range of variation in their speech, depending on the social class and individual acceptance in a particular community of practice. To sum up our discussion, gender is a significant part of a person's identity. Identities, including gender identities, are constructed socially and discursively in particular cultural environments. Gender can be and is publicly displayed as a facet of one's identity. This can be achieved through the choice of masculine or feminine language forms, the invocation of discourse forms culturally allowed or disallowed, typical or stereotypical or atypical of particular genders, and other gender-bound within a particular community of practice modes of behavior, including dress, accessories, mannerisms, or activities. But gender is only one note in the construction of identity. We're not only male, female, or non-binary individuals. We also belong to particular social classes, socially constructed racial and ethnic groups, communities of practice, and so on. The interplay among all these aspects of identity is complex, fluctuating, and dependent on the context of the interaction. Any one of these nodes can become dominant or fade into the background in a specific interactional environment. Gender displays and identifications are not essentialist. Children are socialized into them within the context of their particular cultures.